Good evening, my darlings. I hope everyone is doing well today and is excited for our story time because it's been a couple days since I've been able to get into the book. So I'm excited today to continue reading on. I want to let you know how proud I am for you to keep working on your distance learning online. And even though it's challenging at times, I want you to just know that you got this and we are here for you. So believe in yourself and don't give up. I hope you are ready for our continuation of chapter 7. We have Sadie here and Tank. Hopefully they will sit still for our story time and enjoy our story along with you guys. We are on chapter 7 where they were following a robin for some time. All 4 siblings are in Narnia following a robin. The robin disappears and they see something moving in the woods. And it happens to be a beaver. Now they're following a beaver through the woods. And that is where we kind of left off. We don't know where they're going. We know that they are hungry. They are a little bit concerned about getting lost and about if they will get back, but they decide it's worth following the beaver. So that's where they're on. They're wondering too if they're going to find out information about Mr. Tumnus, the fawn that Lucy met when she first went into Narnia. So we're going to continue reading and see what happens. We left off with them looking at a fine sight, but we don't know what this fine sight is that they were looking at. So that will be our next part of our story. So what we left off reading last was that a minute later they came out under the open sky. The sun was still shining and found themselves looking down on a fine sight. They were standing on the edge of a steep, narrow valley at the bottom of which ran, at least it would have been running if it hadn't been frozen, a fairly large river. Just below them, a dam had been built across this river, and when they saw it, everyone suddenly remembered that of course beavers are always making dams, and felt quite sure that the beaver, or that Mr. Beaver, had made this one. They also noticed that he now had a sort of modest expression on his face, the sort of look people have when you are visiting a garden they've made or reading a story they've written. So it was only common politeness when Susan said, "What a lovely dam!" And Mr. Beaver didn't say, "Hush" this time, but merely a trifle, and it isn't really finished. Above the dam there was what ought to have been a deep pool, but was now, of course, a level floor of dark green ice. And below the dam, much lower down, was more ice. But instead of being smooth, this was all frozen into the foamy and wavy shapes in which the water had been rushing along at the very moment when the frost came. And where the water had been trickling over and spurting through the dam, there was now a glittering wall of icicles, as if the side of the dam had been covered all over with flowers, and wreaths and festoons of the purest sugar. And out in the middle, and partly on top of the dam, was a funny little house shaped rather like an enormous beehive, and from a hole in the roof, smoke was going up. So that when you saw it, especially if you were hungry, you at once thought of cooking and became hungrier than you were before. That was what the others chiefly noticed, but Edmund noticed something else. A little lower down the river there was another small river, which came down another small valley to join it. And looking up that valley, Edmund could see 2 small hills, and he was almost sure they were the 2 hills which the White Witch had pointed out to him when he parted from her at the lamppost the other day. And then between them, he thought, must be her palace. Only a mile off or less. And he thought about Turkish delight and about being a king. And I wonder how Peter will like that, he asked himself. And horrible ideas came into his head. Here we are, said Mr. Beaver. And it looks as if Mrs. Beaver is expecting us. I'll lead the way. But be careful and don't slip. The top of the dam was wide enough to walk on, though not for humans, a very nice place to walk because it was covered with ice. And though the frozen pool was level with it on one side, there was a nasty drop to the lower river on the other side. Along this route, Mr. Beaver led them in a single file right out to the middle, where they could look a long way up the river and a long way down it. And when they had reached the middle, they were at the door of the house. Here we are, Mrs. Beaver, said Mr. Beaver. I've found them. Here are the sons and daughters of Adam and Eve. And they all went in. The first thing Lucy noticed as she went in was a burring sound. And the first thing she saw was a kind-looking old beaver sitting in the corner with a thread in her mouth working busily at her sewing machine. And it was from it that the sound came. She stopped her work and got up as soon as the children came in. And here in our book, we have a picture of the 4 children coming up to the beaver's house. Mr. Beaver leading them in, the smoke coming from the chimney. And on the next page, we see Mrs. Beaver sitting at her sewing machine. So you've come at last, she said, holding out both her wrinkled old paws. At last! To think that ever I should live to this day. The potatoes are on boiling and the kettle's singing, and I dare say, Mr. Beaver, you'll get us some fish. That I will, said Mr. Beaver, and he went out of the house. Peter went with him, and across the ice of the deep pool to where he had a little hole in the ice, which he kept open every day with his hatchet. They took a pail with them. Mr. Beaver sat down quietly at the edge of the hole. He didn't seem to mind it being so chilly. Looked hard into it, then suddenly shot in his paw, and before you could say Jack Robinson had whisked out a beautiful trout. Then he did it all over again until they had a fine catch of fish. Meanwhile, the girls were helping Mrs. Beaver to fill the kettle and lay the table and cut the bread and put the plates in the oven to heat and draw a huge jug of beer for Mr. Beaver from a barrel which stood in one corner of the house, and to put on the frying pan and get the dripping hot. Lucy thought the Beavers had a very snug little home, though it was not at all like Mr. Tumnus's cave. There were no books or pictures, and instead of beds, there were bunks, like on a board ship, built into the wall. And there were hams and strings of onions hanging from the roof. And against the walls were gum boots and oilskins and hatchets and pairs of shears and spades and trowels and things for carrying mortar in and fishing rods and fishing nets and sacks. And the cloth on the table, though very clean, was very rough. Just as the frying pan was nicely hissing, Peter and Mr. Beaver came in with the fish, which Mr. Beaver had already opened with his knife and cleaned out in the open air. You can think how good the new caught fish smelled while they were frying, and how the hungry children longed for them to be done, and how much hungrier still they had become before Mr. Beaver said, "Now we're nearly ready." Susan drained the potatoes and then put them all back in the empty pot to dry on the other side of the range, while Lucy was helping Mrs. Beaver to dish up the trout, so that in a very few minutes everyone was drawing up their stools. It was all 3-legged stools in the Beaver's house, except for Mrs. Beaver's own special rocking chair beside the fire. And preparing to enjoy themselves, there was a jug of creamy milk for the children. Mr. Beaver stuck to the beer, and a great big lump of deep yellow butter in the middle of the table, from which everyone took as much as he wanted to go with his potatoes. And all the children thought, and I agree with them, that there's nothing to beat good freshwater fish if you eat it when it has been alive half an hour ago, and has come out of the pan half a minute ago. And when they had finished the fish, Mrs. Beaver brought unexpectedly out of the oven a great and glorious sticky marmalade roll, steaming hot, and at the same time moved the kettle onto the fire, so that when they had finished the marmalade roll, the tea was made and ready to be poured out. And when each person had got his or her cup of tea, each person shoved back his or her stool so as to be able to lean against the wall, and gave a long sigh of contentment. And now, said Mr. Beaver, pushing away his empty beer mug and pulling his cup of tea toward him, if you'll just wait till I've got my pipe lip up and going nicely, why now we can get to business. It's snowing again, he added, cocking his eye at the window. That's all better, because it means we shan't have any visitors. And if anyone should have been following or trying to follow you, why, he wouldn't find any tracks. And that is the end of chapter 7. They have eaten, they've had a drink, they've had tea, and are in the warm, cozy home of Mr. and Mrs. Beaver. Chapter 8 is the next chapter, and it is titled, What Happened After Dinner? And I am actually quite curious to know what happened after dinner. I feel like I want to know more from this chapter. It kind of ended with not giving me enough information, I feel. I want to know what the beaver knows and whose side is he on, the witch's side or not. I'm assuming maybe not the witch's side, but who knows? We don't really know enough yet, I feel like. So when we read next, we will be reading chapter 8, What Happened After Dinner. So far, so good. They've survived. They're all together. That's a good thing. All 4 siblings have kept together, and no one has harmed them yet. So things are good, and they are on an adventure. So we will see what happens next. I hope you enjoyed tonight's reading of the rest of chapter 7. I think these 2 guys are tuckered out. Tank has put himself to bed because he's had a long day, I think. Tank, do you want to say goodnight? Come here, Tank. Say goodnight to my fellow students. Come here. Come here. You got to say goodnight. Sadie, say goodnight. Tank, come here, baby. Come here. Because he never sits so still, so we need to give him a little bit of a high five for sitting still. You guys don't know how many times it actually took me to read this chapter. Haha, just kidding. Maybe I'm not kidding. Who knows how many times the iPad fell while I'm trying to record. But Tank decided to be quiet for a little bit. So you guys can say goodnight to Tank. Say goodnight. Look at that handsome face. And Sadie. Sadie. She's looking at me. But let's see if we can. I will pull this to us. We say goodnight. Sadie, say goodnight. Good night. Good night from us, Miss Jordan and her fur babies. And just know I love you guys and miss you guys. And I will see you soon. Bye.